the body's reaction to be visible under the microscope or the changes to be present. And those injuries look very much like an injury that occurs a half hour after death. And bleeding alone is not sufficient to distinguish an injury before death or after, say, from a cut wound, because even when we die, the blood vessels are chock full of blood. The blood stays normally right in the blood vessels. Vacuums don't occur. And next day, when we do an autopsy, bleeding occurs. It's passive bleeding from the blood that's already in the blood vessels. And if somebody is cut after death, one can have a little bit of bleeding that looks like it was before death. And people can become cut before death without much bleeding, depending on how the skin capillaries shut down, how the blood vessels shut down. So any injury that occurs around the time of death may be very difficult to interpret when doing the autopsy, and become even more impossible if one is just relying on photographs.
So with relying on photographs, would you say as an expert medical examiner that you could not conclude with a reasonable degree of medical certainty the timing of injuries based on photographs alone?
Depending on the timing. That is, if I'm asked to this injury have occurred 2 days ago and it's beginning to change colors, I might be able to do something like that. But it is not possible, in my opinion, to tell the difference between an injury that occurs 5 minutes before death, cutting injury as in these instances, with one that occurs 5 minutes after death, unless there's a great deal of evidence of the body pumping out blood. See, the pumping action of the heart indicates a person was alive, but passive flow of blood doesn't help.
Now, so if opinions are given, and I think terms are like perimortem and postmortem, those are the medical terms.
That's right.
Those are things you cannot rely upon from photographs shortly before, at the time of, or shortly after.
Yes, that's correct. I agree with what you said.
That you cannot that you cannot reasonably rely on those just based on photographs or colors in photographs.
That's correct.
What about this idea of somebody, Mr. Goldman, being stabbed in this manner and being on the ground, and somebody coming up with a knife and kind of poking at his cheek like you would, well, I don't want to use an analogy of somebody else, but poking on the cheek to see whether he was alive or not. Do you have any experience with that? Do you have any opinion about that?
I've never heard of that being done for purpose of seeing if a person's alive.
You also heard this testimony about these kind of superficial taunting wounds or control wounds to Mr. Goldman. Did you hear that testimony that was offered?
Yes.
In the are you familiar in the common practice of forensic pathology of a term controlled wound?
It's not part of forensic pathologic diagnosis. There are control marks on a body from having the wrists tied together. We can see marks. We can see handcuff marks on the wrist sometimes, but not in the nature that the testimony was with Mr. Goldman, in my opinion.
And you heard the testimony of Dr. Lakshmanan that, in his opinion, these wounds that he described as control wounds or taunting wounds occurred before the cutting of the jugular vein of Mr. Goldman. Did you hear that testimony?
That's my recollection.
Do you agree with that assessment?
No.
Why
No.
not?
I think the cutting of the jugular vein occurred early on in the struggle that he had, and led to his death by hemorrhage over a period of many minutes of hemorrhage from the jugular vein. The other cuts on the neck could have happened after that and near the time of death, because there is very little bleeding in those. But they could have happened after the cut wounds in the neck.
On June the 17th of 1994, you examined Mr. Simpson, did you not?
Yes.
And you examined his hands,
Yes.
and did you notice any cuts on his hand?
Yes, he
hands?
had a healing cut on the middle finger of the left hand, and healing cuts smaller cuts on the inside of the left middle finger and on the outside. Let's see. There were cuts on the fourth and fifth fingers in the skin between the fourth and fifth fingers.
All right, let's first
So there's
focus.
3 different cuts, I think, as I recall.
Right. And some might have been in separate parts, or you...
Yeah,
Let-
it depends. One can count them different ways.
Let's focus in particular on the middle finger of the left hand above the knuckle.
Yes.
That has in previous testimony been referred to as a fishhook injury or cut. Do you have any opinion as to what type of material caused that cut?
Yes, my opinion when I examined the skin, the healing on Friday, that's about 4 or 5 days after the injury occurred, was that it was irregular and more likely due to a broken piece of glass than to a sharp knife.
Now, I want you to assume hypothetically that that injury happened in Los Angeles, and that Mr. Simpson, with that injury, got on a plane in Los Angeles to Chicago, and that injury was not observed by anyone, and no one observed any bandages, Band-Aids, or any type of splint on that finger. In your opinion, if that wound had healed before the person had stopped bleeding, before Mr. Simpson had got on the plane, if he was on that plane for an entire trip from Los Angeles to Chicago, what is the likelihood of that unbandaged finger reopening and bleeding?
I think there was it was likely to bleed further in the course of an unprotected trip like that.
Now,
When I say unprotected, with the finger not being protected.
regarding, is there anything significant about the place of the injury on the knuckle and the closing of a hand?
Yes, it overlaid the knuckles so that when the fingers would be open and closed, it would tend to disturb the clot that was developing and could easily open up for some bleeding to occur. And if it were unprotected by a Band-Aid or a bandage, it'd be easy. Any contact with a chair, with luggage, with movement could cause it to open again. So that I think it would be very likely to bleed further or to be obvious. It would be an obvious wound on the knuckle under those circumstances.
Now, regarding the superficial cuts that you've observed on the sides of the fingers, do you have any opinion as to how long those would bleed before clotting?
They would bleed less profusely. They were less deep, they were smaller, and they weren't over the knuckle area. They were in a protected place so that they could clot and stop bleeding more easily than a cut that was present over the knuckle.
Are these as likely as the knuckle to reopen and bleed if unprotected or unbandaged?
Less likely, less exposed to the environment.
Now, assume Mr. Simpson cut his hand at his residence that resulted in these smaller types of cuts on his finger. And he got these injuries at about 10 o'clock. How long would you anticipate he would bleed?
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our noon recess as far as the jury is concerned at this time. Please remember all my admonitions to you. Don't discuss the case amongst yourselves, form any opinions about the case, conduct any deliberations until the matter has been submitted to you, or allow anybody to communicate with you with regard to the case, and counsel will stand in recess until 1:30. Dr. Baden, you can step down, sir. With counsel for the counsel for the defense. And counsel, the issues regarding discovery of the SDT materials will take up at 5 o'clock today. I'd like to finish as much of Dr. Baden as we can. I understand Ms. Sager wants to come in on behalf of some of the news media people who are subpoenaed for next week to make some arguments, so we'll take that up at 5:30. So we'll take up the discovery issues at 5 and hopefully have enough time to get into the news media issues. But I'd like to at least finish the direct examination of Dr. Baden this afternoon.
Yes, we will do that easily. We'll have enough time to start the cross-examination.
Okay.
And I assume that the presence of the media people will be for the purpose of reporter too.
Yes, that's one of the issues. And apparently there's some problem regarding availability of witnesses and counsel for the witnesses is one of the issues. Okay, let's have the jurors, Deputy McNair. Resume the witness stand, please. All right, let the record reflect that we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel, that Dr. Michael Baden is again on the witness stand, undergoing direct examination by Mr. Shapiro. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And Mr. Shapiro, you may continue with your direct examination.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, Dr. Baden.
Good afternoon, Mr. Shapiro.
Dr. Baden, when we broke for our lunch recess, I was asking you to consider the superficial cuts on Mr. Simpson's hand. My question in that regard is, do you have any opinion as to how long it would take for those superficial cuts to stop bleeding?
Yes,
And what is that opinion?
6 to 8 minutes.
I want to now direct your attention to your observations and conclusions of Nicole Brown Simpson on the night she was murdered. I want to first ask you, did you examine all the material to come to a conclusion as to whether or not there was a struggle between Nicole Brown Simpson and her assailants?
Yes, I did.
Did you examine the neck area in photographs of Nicole Brown Simpson and see 4 different stab wounds?
Yes.
And were those stab wounds of blunt edges going in different directions?
Yes.
Would you describe those as a cluster of stab wounds?
Sustained.
How would you describe those stab wounds?
There was a grouping or cluster of stab wounds in the left side of the neck, but they were of different orientation. It wasn't rapid fire. The position of the knife and the skin changed during the course of stab
Different-
wounds.
For purposes of explaining to the jury different orientation, could you just try to paint a picture in words for them?
Well, if a weapon, say a single-edged weapon, is stabbed into somebody very rapidly and the victim is not moving, then a very tight grouping of stab wounds, all oriented in the same direction, since the weapon in the hand tends to be oriented in the same direction, can occur and can indicate a very rapid striking of a person who isn't moving. And that can be an interpretation sometimes of stab wounds.
Were you able to come to any conclusion regarding injuries on Nicole Brown Simpson's hands?
There were stab wounds and injuries on Nicole Brown Simpson's hands.
And could you describe for the jury what those injuries resulted from, in your opinion?
In my opinion, they represent what's been described previously as defensive type wounds that occurred while she was attempting to ward off blows or blows with a weapon.
And in your opinion, would those injuries cause a bleeding of her palm areas of the hand?
Yes, yes.
I want to direct your attention now to blood under the fingernails of Nicole Brown Simpson. Are you familiar with cases where a victim has scratched at and clawed an assailant?
Yes.
And do you have an opinion as to whether or not that type of reaching out and scratching of the skin that would result in blood would also result in a scraping of the skin on the part of the perpetrator or perpetrators?
Objection, Your Honor, unless we're talking about this case.
Rephrase the question.
In this case, there's evidence that Nicole Brown Simpson had blood under her fingernails.
Yes.
If that blood was the result of her scratching out at an assailant or assailants, would you expect that she would also have skin under her fingernails?
No, I would not expect it. Although it's possible, it rarely happens.
What would you expect and why?
Well, just from experience, when scratching occurs during a struggle, wounds can open up on the skin of the assailant, of the scratched person, but the skin is often pushed to the side, a little blood comes under the fingernails, and it is very unusual to find the skin from a perpetrator underneath the fingernails of a victim, even though we often look for it. It is much more common, well, it's uncommon also to find assailant's blood, but that's more common, appreciably more common than finding assailant's skin.
If that blood was not the blood of Nicole Brown Simpson, would that indicate to you that there would be injuries on someone else?
It would strongly suggest that.
There was some discussion by Dr. Lakshmanan about the state of consciousness of Nicole Brown Simpson. Do you recall that testimony?
Yes.
Is it your opinion, doctor, that prior to the time Nicole Brown Simpson's throat was cut, that she was unconscious?
No, it isn't my opinion.
What is your opinion in that regard?
My opinion is that Ms. Simpson struggled for some period of time with the assailant, during which time she received various stab wounds, including the injuries to the hands. And when she suffered the fatal cut wound of the neck, her neck was above the bottom staircase. It was at least 18, 20 inches off the ground, because much of the spurting blood from the cut through the carotid arteries went in that direction, toward the top of the first staircase and the riser on the second staircase, so that, in my opinion, she wasn't lying unconscious on the ground. Her neck was above that level when she was cut.
So is it your opinion, doctor, that the contusion that you discovered in the tissue at the coroner's office of Nicole Brown Simpson's part of the brain, that the injury that caused that did not result in her being unconscious?
Yes, that would be my opinion. Such an injury can or cannot be associated with loss of consciousness. One needn't lose consciousness. And I think the position of her neck at the time that she forcefully bled from the carotid arteries that were cut would indicate she was not unconscious on the ground, but was at least somewhat higher.
In the order of occurrence of the stab wounds and injuries to Nicole Brown Simpson, do you have an opinion as to when her throat was slashed?
Yes, I agree with Dr. Lakshmanan's interpretation that most likely was the final injury she received, and she would have lost consciousness within seconds of suffering that cut wound because of the marked decrease in blood flow to the brain. The brain would have been deprived of oxygen, and she would have lost consciousness.
Now, there was a suggestion in the testimony by Dr. Lakshmanan that Nicole Brown Simpson was lying on the ground unconscious and that a shoe print was placed on her back by the assailant. Do you agree with that conclusion?
No, I disagree with that conclusion.
And why do you disagree with that conclusion, sir?
I disagree with that conclusion because there's nothing in the photographs or on the dress or on the body that, to me, looks like a shoe print. That when Dr. Golden did the autopsy, he specifically says that there's no injury in that area, and the little purple discolorations that are present that were referred to on the boards as a shoe print, in my opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, is just the way blood settles after death and the variations in how the body changes after death. She'd been laying on her back for many hours prior to the taking of that photograph. And my opinion is that there's no evidence at all to indicate that that's a shoe print on the back. If a shoe print were placed down hard enough to cause bruises and an imprint on the skin, given the circumstances, the setting, the soil, the area of struggle that had gone on in that narrow area where Mr. Golden was found, there would also have to be some imprint of the soil or dirt or blood on the clothing and on the back also. That wasn't present either.
Is there any way a expert medical examiner could have performed any further type of test at the autopsy to confirm the cause of the discoloration?
Oh, surely. If there was any hint to Dr. Golden or to the other, remember there were Ms. Ratcliffe, there were criminalists, there were all technicians, there were many people who were present and who saw the back. If any of them had thought that there was a bruise or a bruise in the nature of a shoe print or any kind of bruise, a simple incision at the time of the autopsy could have distinguished between the normal settling of blood after death, the lividity that's been spoken of, which is the settling of blood in blood vessels. The blood vessels are all intact, as opposed to a bruise where there's hemorrhage outside of the blood vessels. And a simple incision by Dr. Golden would have shown whether or not there was a bruise present. Medical examiner doesn't normally do that unless there's reason to make incisions because of the care and sanctity of the body, but Dr. Golden clearly states there's no bruise there in his autopsy report.
You heard Dr. Lakshmanan speculate that,
Your Honor, I'll object. That misstates the testimony and argument.
I haven't said what he speculated on. I haven't. You heard Dr. Lakshmanan speculate
Your Honor, I object to the word speculate.
that one way that Nicole Brown Simpson could have been killed was that the perpetrator had a shoe on her back, pulled her hair up, hyperextended her neck, and slit her throat. And the evidence of this was that there was no blood in her lungs.
Your Honor, I object. That misstates Dr. Lakshmanan's testimony. It has to be heard aside.
All right. Did you hear Dr. Lakshmanan's testimony regarding Nicole Brown Simpson being on the ground unconscious, having her hair pulled back, her neck hyperextended, and her throat slit? Did
Yes,
you hear
I
that
did.
testimony?
Yes.
Did he offer an explanation for that?
Well, he described it and supported it by the fact that there was no sucking of blood into the lungs, or aspirating blood.
In your opinion, is there any way a responsible medical examiner could offer that opinion with a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
I think Dr. Lakshmanan is responsible in general terms, but I think that I disagree with that opinion. I think it's a wrong opinion.
And why do you disagree with that?
Whether or not a victim sucks blood into his or her lungs, and in this instance, Ms. Simpson didn't and Mr. Golden did, depends on a stab wound going through the windpipe, opening up the windpipe or the mouth area so that blood can get in, and then the person living long enough to inhale it. Inhalation of blood into the lungs is aspiration. And that could happen with the neck flexed or with the chin against almost against the chest. It has nothing to do with the hyperextension of the neck. It has to do with whether there's bleeding into the airway, air passage area, and whether the person lives long enough to be able to inhale the blood. And then nothing to do with hyperextension.
We have now gone through a series of questions on a general category of discussion as to whether or not, in your opinion, Nicole Brown Simpson struggled with the perpetrator or perpetrators of this crime. Based on what you have told the jury, do you have an opinion as to whether or not she was, in fact, engaged in a struggle prior to her death?
Yes, I have an opinion.
What is that opinion?
My opinion is she struggled with the assailant or assailants prior to succumbing when her neck was cut.
And why is it your opinion that there was a struggle between Nicole Brown Simpson and her assailant or assailants prior to the time she died?
Well, because there were about 9 or 10 stab wounds and cut wounds on her body before she suffered the fatal injury, because there were cut wounds on her hands in a defensive manner, and because the stab wounds on the neck, the 4 or 5 stab wounds on the neck were of different positions, indicating motion between the weapon and the skin. which is typical in a struggle, and that she suffered no incapacitating injury until the final cut wound of the carotid arteries. Up until that point, there was no reason for her to be unconscious and not to struggle, except for the bruise on the brain. And that will knock some people out, and some people won't lose consciousness. It certainly can cause a person to fall downward.
So it's your opinion that you could not offer an opinion with a reasonable degree of medical certainty whether or not that contusion would cause unconsciousness.
That's correct.
But there is no question in your mind that there was a struggle.
That's my opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty.
I want to direct your attention now towards the murder of Ronald Goldman. And again, focus the overall attention on whether or not, in your opinion, there was a struggle. In that regard, was there any evidence of wounds on the hands of Ronald Goldman?
Yes.
What evidence was there?
There were stab wounds on the hands, again in a defensive manner, and called defensive wounds by Dr. Golden. And there were bruises on the backs of the hands and the knuckles and the fingers of the hands.
Is it your experience that defensive wounds in a assault by a knife would generally cause injuries to the victim's palm and not cause cuts to the tops of the hands?
Yes.
Does the fact that there were no cuts on the back of the hand indicate that Mr. Goldman did not make a fist?
It does not, in my opinion, has no indication that he didn't make a fist or didn't attempt to use a fist in a protective or offensive manner.
I'm sorry, I wasn't clear. Offensive or protective? Thank you.
If there was an opinion offered that because there were no cuts or bruises beyond one knuckle, that would mean that there was no attempt to strike the assailant, would you agree or disagree with that proposition?
I disagree with that.
Now, the hand wounds to Mr. Goldman were 3 stab wounds?
Yes. 2 on the right hand and 1 on the left hand, if I recall.
And the area where Mr. Goldman had defensive wounds on his hands, would they bleed a lot?
Yes. Yes.
Now, there was evidence that there was an injury to a knuckle on Mr. Goldman. Did you observe that?
I observed that in the autopsy report and the photographs, yes.
And is that injury consistent with striking a person?
Yes, it is.
And if that injury was caused by striking a person, do you have an opinion as to whether or not it would leave a mark on the person who was struck?
Yes, I have an opinion that it's likely that a mark would be left, but it's not absolute. Not every punch leaves a mark, but it certainly would indicate that it landed with force on the person that struck.
Do you have an opinion as to whether or not that injury was caused by moving back and hitting your knuckle, or on Mr. Goldman, hitting his knuckle on a tree?
I have an opinion that it is not my opinion that it happened that way.
Do you have an opinion as to whether it occurred by Mr. Goldman backing up and hitting his knuckle on a wrought iron fence?
My opinion is it did not. The injuries did not happen that way.
Why is that?
A lot of force is involved, and a great deal more force can be generated by punching forward with a hand than by flailing backwards against a fence. There's not enough force generated, and it's kind of purposeless motion. This is typical for injuries in punching somebody, and which medical examiners, doctors see not uncommonly. And it'd be very odd to have it against a wrought iron fence and have to be a fence that was punched with the same degree of force that you'd punch a body, and that's hard to do by flailing backwards.
The evidence has shown that there were numerous or multiple stab wounds on Mr. Goldman. Did you count the number of stab wounds that he had?
Yes, I did. There are more than 22 stab wounds of various kind. In addition to the 22, there are some other clusterings of wounds that could be individually called stab wounds, and maybe one could have 30 stab wounds, but at least 22, depending on how one counted them.
Would you agree that there are a significant number of stab wounds on
Yes.
Mr. Goldman?
Yes.
And did those stab wounds come from different directions, in your opinion?
Yes, they came from different directions, some front, some back, some from the side.
Now, is there any evidence that Mr. Goldman attempted to kick his assailant or assailants?
Yes, there is.
And what evidence have you found in that regard of Mr. Goldman kicking his assailant or assailants?
Yeah, the evidence would be that, I believe on his right shoe, there's a cut on the top of the shoe near the toe area, which is not proof that he kicked at somebody, but is indicative of that.
Did you examine, when you went to the police department, the shoes and see photographs of the shoes that Mr.
Yes.
Goldman was wearing?
Yes. I'm sorry, sir. I'm also anxious to get out of here.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness? Please show you a photograph in the bottom right-hand corner.
So the number for this photograph, Your Honor?
Yes,
13?
16. Photograph. Do you see a photograph that shows the cut on the shoe of Mr. Goldman?
Yes.
And would you, with the court's permission, may he come point that out to the jury, Your Honor?
Thank you.
And perhaps, I don't know, do you have a magnifying glass that might be helpful to see?
I just happen to have one of those around, I think.
Thank you. Would you come and, with the court's permission, just teach juror where the, or pass it down? Can he point out the area, Your Honor, to the jury?
Yes, actually, Dr. Baden, why don't you, in the middle of the jury box, just point out what it is you're directing your attention to, so they...
If you'll come here, Dr. Baden.
Your Honor, the only difficulty I have is this page has 4 apparent photographs. It appears that they're using one photograph, and that's the one that's marked for identification. I would ask that
Dr.
all...
Baden's folded it over so we have the pertinent photograph.
Thank you, Your
Why
Honor.
don't we put it on the elmo and you just point to where it is,
Well, it's going to be hard to,
so that they know where to look.
where to look first. Okay, thank you. That's a good suggestion.
Thank you.
Actually, you can see it pretty good on this elmo.
There's a little horizontal cut up on the right shoe near the inner tip is what I was referring to.
They got pretty clear.
Yes, yes, I didn't think we'd come across that clearly.
Right, sure, come on, yes, they can see.
I think we can take that down now. I'm sorry, Barry? Dr. Baden, whoops. Okay. Right.
All right, we use the printout. Proceed.
Based on what you have just testified to, Do you have an opinion as to whether or not Ronald Goldman struggled with his assailants or assailant?
Yes, I have an opinion
And what is that opinion?
that Ronald Goldman did struggle with his assailant or assailants.
And what is the basis for your opinion that there was a struggle prior to the time he was killed?
Basis for my opinion is that he had multiple cut wound injuries over different parts of the body, front and back, face and neck, chest and abdomen, which occurred in different positions, that he had injuries on his hands indicative of protective, defensive, offensive wounds, that the blood on his clothing, remember, the jeans especially, show that he was standing for time enough from the bleeding from the neck, the left jugular vein, to flow out of the cut down the left side of his body, down the jeans, staining the jeans, and into his shoes, which takes time. The crime scene also is indicative of struggle with a lot of disturbance of the soil and earth in the area that he collapsed and died. And I think that the cut on the shoe is also indicative of a knife coming across that shoe at some point, indicative of a struggle.
You have just told the jury that Mr. Goldman's jugular vein was cut and blood would ooze from that.
Yes.
Would that injury prevent him from screaming?
No, he had no injury to his vocal cords or his body that would have prevented him from calling out, screaming, making words, or neither did Miss Simpson. She also was able to, had no injury that would have prevented her from crying out.
In your opinion, was Mr. Goldman capable of screaming before his jugular vein was cut?
Yes.
In your opinion, was Mr. Goldman capable of screaming after his jugular vein was cut but before death?
Yes.
If there was an assailant who had his hand over Mr. Goldman's mouth to prevent him from screaming, would that necessarily leave any identifiable marks that would be seen at autopsy?
Covering the mouth or even the nose with a hand, as you say, would not cause any injury that could be seen at autopsy.
Would a hand over the mouth stop somebody from screaming?
If it were held tightly enough, yes.
Could a hand around the throat stop somebody from screaming?
A hand or a chokehold type with a forearm would prevent somebody from screaming, yes.
Would a chokehold or a hand on the throat leave any noticeable injuries that would be seen at the autopsy?
Not in this instance, no.
Now, I want to go back now and specifically direct your attention to the jugular vein cut and focus the jury's attention, if I might, on that. You described that cut as causing blood that would ooze. Is that correct?
Yes.
If a person is cut in the jugular vein and the blood is oozing, is the person still capable of standing?
Yes.
Is the person still capable of struggling?
Yes.
If there's blood that came down onto the right side of the shirt as a result of a cut on the jugular vein on the left side, would that have any effect on your opinion as to whether or not there was a struggle?
No.
In viewing this injury to the throat, do you have an opinion as to how long Mr. Goldman could have been standing after that injury?
In my opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, after the jugular vein was cut, from the time of the cutting until he would collapse because of blood loss, could be many minutes.
Could a person survive that wound?
Yes.
How long could a person survive that wound?
If a person is brought promptly to a hospital, as opposed to the carotid arteries, which caused the injury to which caused the death of Miss Simpson, which caused rapid bleeding very quickly and cuts off oxygen going to the brain. The veins, the jugular vein, is a low pressure system and is bringing blood back to the heart, and it bleeds very much more slowly, and it would take many minutes of bleeding from the jugular vein to lower the blood pressure enough so a person would even get woozy and fall to the ground. At that time, the person would still be alive.
Was there a thigh wound observed on Mr. Golden?
Yes,
What side?
on the left side through the pocket area.
And was there a lot of blood on Mr. Golden's left pant leg?
Yes,
And was there a lot of blood on Mr. Goldman's left shoe?
yes.
I'm almost finished, Your Honor. I mean, they had a long time on there.
I understand that, but if we covered the issues.
Well, I want to tie this all together in a different way, if I may, please. And what does that indicate to you in relationship to what position Mr. Goldman was at?
That at the time of the thigh wound, he was still standing because the blood was going still downward together with the blood coming down from the left side of the neck.
And would that be consistent with him standing during a struggle?
Yes,
Did you observe 2 wounds to the chest of Mr. Goldman?
yes,
Did those wounds pierce his lung?
yes. There were 2 stab wounds to the right side of the chest that caused lacerations in the lower part of the right lung.
And did you observe a stab wound on the side of his abdomen that pierced his aorta?
Yes, there was another stab wound on the left side of the abdomen that went from left to right through the aorta about 1.5 inches above the belly button.
Would you describe to us, please, what the aorta is and where it's located in the body?
The aorta, as we remember from biology days, is the main blood vessel that brings blood with oxygen from the heart to the rest of the body. As the heart pumps out blood, the blood comes up the aorta, 20% goes up to the head and brain, and the other 80% goes downward to all the other organs and muscles of the body. The aorta is the largest blood vessel in the body and carries that 80% downward.
Now, of all the wounds you've described, they all bled. Is that correct?
Yes.
All 22 to 30 wounds.
Yes, except the superficial cuts on the neck may not have bled.
Is there a difference between internal bleeding and external bleeding?
Well, what it refers to is bleeding inside the body and bleeding outside the body. It doesn't, either way, has the same effect on cardiac function. If the blood gets out of the blood vessels, then it's not available to go to the brain, the kidneys, and the other parts of the body. So in that sense, it doesn't matter whether it bleeds inside or outside if it's going to go out of the blood vessels.
Now my question to you is, on the jugular vein, would that cause external bleeding or internal bleeding?
External bleeds outside the body, and that's the blood that trickled down the chest and down the to the left shoe, the left side of the body.
The thigh, the palm injuries.
External bleeding, and that's bleeding on the ground, on a perpetrator, on outside the body,
The thigh injury,
outside the body.
the chest and the aorta.
The chest and the aorta are internal bleeding, bleed inside the body, and the body captures that blood so it doesn't get lost, but it's not useful blood.
Do you have an opinion as to which came first? The cut of the jugular vein or the stab wounds to the chest?
In my opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, the cut wound of the neck came first.
How much blood is contained in an average adult male?
About 5 quarts.
How long, you've told us, well, let me ask you this in this way. How long could someone survive after having a jugular vein cut? How long could they survive?
Assuming it's a transection, a cut, as in Mr. Goldman, cut completely through, a person with a jugular vein cut could stay alive, not necessarily conscious, for 10, 20 minutes, if it's untreated. Much of that time he might be unconscious.
And how much blood would accumulate in the chest cavity as a result of the chest wounds here? Do you have any way of knowing how much blood accumulated?
Yes.
And how do you know that?
Dr. Golden, in doing the autopsy, as is appropriate, measured the amount of blood that was in the cavity surrounding the lungs, that measures the amount of blood coming out of the right lung. It was 2 of them, the right chest and the right lung, and he estimated, he says between 100 and 200 cc. It's about 3 to 7 ounces of blood.
Can you tell this jury with a reasonable degree of medical certainty how long it was between the time Mr. Goldman's jugular vein was cut and he was stabbed in the chest?
Yes.
Tell the ladies and gentlemen
Yeah,
how long that was.
100 to 200 cc of blood is a very small amount of blood to bleed from stab wounds of the lung. So my opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, is that when he suffered the stab wounds of the lung, his heart was not functioning properly. He had already, the blood pressure had fallen considerably so that not much blood could flow out of the damaged lungs. So, in my opinion, the reason that Mr. Goldman died was because of the blood loss from the internal jugular vein laceration. That was the major source of the bleeding, even though he had other wounds. None of them bled as much. And that it would have taken about 10 minutes, certainly not less than 5 minutes, for enough blood to be lost, 1,000, 1,500 cc of blood to be lost, that the lung would not be pumping out blood when the lungs were stabbed. Because my opinion is based on the fact that when the lungs are stabbed, the heart is not pumping effectively. And it would take at least 5-10 minutes for the heart to stop pumping effectively after he started bleeding from the jugular vein.
Could it have been as long as 15 minutes between the time the jugular vein was cut and the chest wounds?
There's so many factors involved, individual factors, it's possible. Yes, it could be. Could be.
Do you know when in the struggle, in time, from the beginning to the time, how much time elapsed before Mr. Goldman's jugular vein was cut?
No, no.
Could have been 1, 2, 3 minutes into the
Yeah,
struggle?
there could have been a struggle going on, hand cuts, other injuries. I can only start dating the length of time to die once the left jugular vein is cut. At some point, the left jugular vein gets cut, and then he will bleed slowly for many minutes until his heart can no longer pump blood when his lung is cut.
Was the cut to the chest which you have told us could have been as long as 15 minutes, more likely 10 minutes, and as little as 5 minutes after the jugular vein. Was that necessarily the last wound to Mr. Goldman?
No, no.
If Ronald Goldman began a struggle with his assailants at 10:40 p.m., within a reasonable degree of medical certainty, can you tell us when the stab wound to the chest would have occurred?
My opinion would be at least 5 minutes, more likely around 10 minutes after the neck started to bleed.
So if the struggle started, just take basic minimum times now, if the struggle started at 10:40, taking into account that there could have been injuries and struggle before the jugular vein was cut, and there could have been injuries after the chest, what is the earliest time that he would have been cut in the chest, in your opinion?
In my opinion, 10:45.
Could have been as late as 10:50
Yes,
or later.
yes.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And good afternoon, Dr. Baden.
Good afternoon, Mr. Kelberg.
Dr. Baden, a couple preliminary questions. Number one, I have never retained you on behalf of the District Attorney's Office to review any case of our office. Is that correct?
I've spoken to you in the past,
Sir, my
but I
question.
have not been retained by you.
In fact, I reminded you, our only previous professional contact was you were retained by a lawyer representing a physician I was investigating in a case of possible physician-assisted suicide. And that was our contact, a brief telephone conversation about some of your findings. Recall that, sir?
A telephone conversation. I don't remember how brief it was.
So, sir, I have never retained you on behalf of our office, correct?
No, not that I'm aware of.
You have never been an expert witness on behalf of our office in a case in which I've been the prosecutor?
I'm not sure about that. I was advised that you had suggested me to...
Your Honor, I'll move to strike.
Repeat it?
The question was, sir, you have never testified on behalf of our office in a case in which I've been the prosecutor, correct?
That's correct, as far as...
And in fact, doctor, you have testified on behalf of our office in trial on only one incident, the Boggs case, although you've testified in 2 separate trials. Isn't that correct, sir?
No, that's not correct.
Sir, you said that Kathy Evelyn Smith's case, the Belushi case, you testified at trial. That's your recollection?
That's my recollection. Yeah.
Didn't she plead guilty to involuntary manslaughter, and that you testified at the preliminary hearing, not at the trial, sir? There was no jury. Isn't that correct?
I remember being cross-examined by Mr. Weitzman and being examined by Mr. Montagna. I remember it as a trial. Maybe it's a different name for it.
If it wasn't a trial, if there wasn't a jury, if it was a preliminary hearing, then it would be correct to say, isn't it, sir, that you have only testified on behalf of our office rising out of one case, the Ellis Green death.
I have testified at trials with no juries. I've testified at bench trials, so I don't know.
On behalf of our office, sir.
Look, Mr. Kelberg, you know better than I what happened with Mr. Belushi. I testified at the grand jury. I testified in some kind of a court setting. Maybe it wasn't a trial. I don't know.
Doctor, please listen to the question carefully. Sir, is it accurate to say that you have testified in trial with a jury present on behalf of our office only in the cases arising out of the death of Ellis Green, the Boggs, Hanson, Hawkins case, prosecuted by Mr. McKenzie? Isn't that correct, sir?
I said to you, I don't know that. I remember testifying at the Belushi, what I thought was a trial.
And if that wasn't a trial, then is the answer yes?
Yes.
And, sir, that death occurred in 1988, didn't it? The Ellis Green death?
I believe so.
And you were retained in 1989, weren't you?
I believe so.
Have you been retained by our office at any time since 1989 for any case other than the Boggs, Hanson, Hawkins case?
Just the recent trials on Hansen and Hawkins that just completed.
My question was, sir, have you been, and please listen carefully, have you been retained by our office since 1989 on any case other than the Boggs, Hansen, Hawkins trials arising out of the death of Ellis Green in 1988?
No.
Doctor, how much money have you been paid for your involvement in the Simpson case to this point in time?
It's about 70 times 1,500, which would be about $100,000.
Well, you said that you've been out in Los Angeles for about 70 days since the middle of June. Is that correct?
Yes.
You did work on this case well before coming out here in June for this 70-day period, didn't you, sir?
I've done a lot of work in New York.
Yes. And, sir,
Yeah.
you were billing for that time, too, aren't you, sir?
No, I'm only billing for the time I come to Los Angeles.
How many hours have you spent on this case prior to coming to Los Angeles?
Today? Now?
Prior to coming to Los Angeles in June, sir, how many hours have you spent on this case
June of what?
of 1995 when you started your 70-day period out here? Doctor, is it correct to say that since June of 95 you've been out here for 70 days?
No.
Or 70 days from the time you first got involved in the case and came out on June 16th?
70 days from the time I was first involved in the case in June 14th, 1994.
And you arrived here on June 16th, I think was your testimony.
94.
Correct.
Yes.
All right. Other than those 70 days then, sir, how many hours have you spent on the case?
Oh, I would imagine 100, 200 hours in New York City from when I was in New York, for which I didn't bill.
Now, sir, you said on direct that you've spent at least 200 hours on the phone with Mr. Shapiro on the case. Was that accurate testimony?
I've spent a lot of time on the phone with Mr. Shapiro, for which I don't bill him.
Did you say you spent 200 hours?
I don't recall.
Well,
My
if you-
memory, if I said it, I said it, yeah. I spent a lot of time on the phone with Mr. Shapiro.
Are those calls primarily calls when you're in New York and he's in Los Angeles?
That's correct.
Now, sir, isn't your usual billing rate for parties that retain you $250 to $300 an hour?
That's correct.
So if you were to charge for those 200 hours of phone calls, that would be another $75,000, I'm sorry, $60,000 if it's $300 an hour. Isn't that correct? Doctor, let me briefly move to another area and I'll come back to this. In Mr. Cochran's opening statement, he referred to you as one of the foremost pathologists in the United States. Do you agree that that is an accurate description of you?
I don't characterize myself. I'm a forensic pathologist. There aren't too many forensic pathologists around in this country, and I'm one of a small group of forensic pathologists.
You've known Dr. Lakshmanan Satyavajaswaran since about 1975?
Yes,
Do you consider him one of the foremost forensic pathologists in the United States?
I think he's a fine person and
My
and
question,
a good forensic pathologist.
my question, sir, is do you consider Dr. Lakshmanan Satyavajaswaran to be one of the foremost forensic pathologists in the United States?
I would say that, no.
Now, doctor, do you consider yourself one of the foremost pathologists forensic pathologists in the area of time of death determination?
I consider myself an ordinary forensic pathologist trying to do what we're taught to do and what our experience teaches us to do as best we can.
Do you consider yourself expert as a forensic pathologist in determination of time of death?
I think as much as all forensic pathologists have expertise and experience in determining time of death,
Do you think you have...
and since I've been at it longer than most, I have a little more experience than most, but I don't consider myself foremost in anything. I'm just trying to do the best I can.
Doctor, did you bring your curriculum vitae with you?
I don't think I have one with me, no, but I think attorneys may have.
Well, I have a copy in case Mr. Shapiro doesn't. I'm sorry? May I borrow yours then, because I assume that's going to be the most up-to-date. Okay. Your Honor, I have a document labeled Curriculum Vitae, Michael M. Baden, M.D. May this be marked as the people's next in order. 579? May I, for the record, then on the front page, I'll write 579. May I approach? Dr. Baden, let me show you this exhibit 579. Are you familiar with it?
Yes.
And that is, in fact, the curriculum vitae you provided to Mr. Shapiro to provide to us?
It's a curriculum vitae provided to Mr. Shapiro at some point.
May I collect it, Your Honor? In fact, Doctor, why don't you hold on to that copy, and I'll use, I think I have another one. And Doctor, this is the same curriculum vitae that was used by Mr. McKenzie in the Hawkins-Hanson case when you recently testified, isn't that correct?
I would imagine so. I'm not sure.
Now, sir, you, in this document, include your professional publications, don't you?
Yes.
Have you ever published an article in any forensic pathology text on the subject of time of death determination?
I don't believe so, no.
Have you ever published an article in any recognized forensic pathology text on the subject of sharp force injuries, including stab wounds?
Not specifically, no.
Doctor, have you ever published a chapter in any recognized forensic pathology textbook on the subject of blunt force trauma?
No.
Have you ever published a chapter in any recognized forensic pathology textbook on the subject of blood spatter analysis?
No.
Have you ever published a chapter in any recognized forensic pathology textbook on crime scene collection?
No.
Doctor, have you ever published a chapter in any recognized forensic pathology text on the subject of shoe print analysis?
No.
Shoe print comparison?
No.
Have you ever published anything in any peer-reviewed journal on any of the topics I just gave you?
No, I haven't.
Doctor, you're familiar with Dr. Spitz
Yes.
and his book Spitz and Fisher,
Yes.
3rd edition?
Yes.
In the 1st edition, you did publish a chapter. You were a contributor to a chapter in that book, weren't you, sir?
I wrote a chapter
What was that chapter about, sir?
on drug abuse.
And in fact, that is what you claim to be your primary area of specialty within the field of forensic pathology. Isn't that the case?
Not quite.
Well,
if,
sir, I'm sorry.
if I may answer.
Sure.
It's the area that I did most of my publishing when I was in New York City, and we used to see a lot of drug abuse deaths. So that was the area that I had special interest in.
And sir, when you say that's where you published most of your materials in your curriculum vitae, you list 80 publications, don't you?
Yes.
And of those 80, what number relate to the subject of drug and or alcohol?
The great
abuse?
majority. I'm sorry. The great majority.
And doctor, when did you publish, well, if you look at your curriculum vitae, item 73 is published in the Journal of Trauma in 1979. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then the next, starting with 74 through 80, I'm sorry, 74 through 79 go through the period of 1980, 81, 83, 85, correct?
Yes.
Now, sir, what have you published since you left the medical examiner's office in New York City in 1985?
Well, I wrote a book that you may have, and I'm in the process of writing a textbook
Now,
where I'll cover the points that you've raised.
the book that you wrote, you've told us about, you gave the title as Unnatural Death, Confessions of a Medical Examiner, is that
Yeah,
correct?
that was meant for public reading.
You would not hold this out as the kind of forensic pathology textbook, for example, that Spitz and Fisher's medical legal investigation of death is, would you, sir?
That's correct. The latter is a textbook, and this is meant as a nonfiction book.
Or, for example, Dr. Knight's forensic pathology text?
That's correct. It's not a textbook. It's a
Now, sir, when you've testified at least 1,000 times in your 30-year career, haven't you, sir?
Including grand juries, certainly, yes.
And, sir, you're commonly asked, since you wrote this book, aren't you, on direct examination, the title of the book?
I'm sorry?
When you're questioned by the party calling you as a witness, you're commonly asked to give the title of this book, aren't you?
Sometimes.
And don't you, without variation, give the title as unnatural death when the question is asked by the party calling you?
No, it depends. The title is Unnatural Death. Its subtitle is Confessions of a Medical Examiner.
Isn't it usually through cross-examination that you have to testify that it has a subtitle, Confessions of a Medical Examiner?
No.
Well, it's been answered, but let's move on.
Doctor, the subtitle, Confessions of a Medical Examiner, does that imply that you have sins that you confess to in this book?
No, it doesn't. It implies that the United States has sins that we have to address.
Doctor, are you critical at all of yourself in this book?
Sure,
How?
I'm part of the problem, that there is the investigation of unnatural death in this country, and it's one of the themes of my book, is a national disgrace, that most instances where autopsies are done, investigations are done, and people are murdered. There's 75 people today who are murdered in the United States, and the great majority of those murders are being investigated by persons not trained to do those investigations, including physicians who are trained to be good hospital doctors, but who are not trained in forensic pathology, and that's why lots of mistakes occur in this country, and it has a relevance to capital punishment.
Doctor, my question was, for example, you are critical of the autopsies performed by a number of doctors in cases that you use as case examples in this book, are you not?
Yeah, I do refer to cases, to autopsies, including that of President Kennedy, that were not done to the standards of a proper forensic pathologist.
You are critical of a number of physicians who performed autopsies in cases that you use in this book. Isn't that correct, sir?
Yes.
Are you ever critical in this book of any autopsy you ever performed?
I'm critical of my early attitudes, you know, when I was starry-eyed and thought the media and the attention was a positive force.
My question...
But I don't think I'd have to look through it again. I haven't really read through it in a long time.
Well, sir, can you remember any incident
In which I'm critical of me?
of where you are critical of any autopsy you performed?
I believe so, but I don't have anything that I could recall at this moment.
Well, maybe if we don't finish today and you're back tomorrow over the evening, I'll be glad to lend you my copy.
If
you
that
want to take a look.
possibility exists, I will be glad to do that, Mr. Kelberg.
Now, Doctor, in fact, you alluded to it, I think, on direct exam, but let me go to an area in your book that discusses your attitude towards the press. If I could have just a moment, Your Honor. Did you write this in your book? I liked the reporters and the television cameras. The fact that they were covering my work added importance to it, an extra dimension. The visibility counterbalanced the low esteem in which we were held by the rest of the medical profession. Forensic pathology was filled with misfits. It was considered a dumping ground for incompetence, a field that alcoholics descended into, a refuge for doctors who couldn't make it in the real world. Did you write that in your book, Doctor?
Yes, and that reminds me, that's being self-critical. I'm entering a field that is poorly thought of by other physicians.
Doctor,
Absolutely.
is that critical of your performance of an autopsy?
It's my
That's argumentative, it's just a,
Well, Doctor,
no, but let's wind this up.
Doctor, do you still like the press?
I think the press has a duty to inform the public. I think that it's a siren's call for the forensic pathologist, because it can only lead to trouble for the forensic pathologist.
Doctor, my question, though, was, do you still like the press?
Not in the sense that you read from it. I think I have the highest regard for the press and the job the press attempts to do, but I think that the medical examiner has to be very wary of the press and what's in the long run.
Doctor, have you appeared on any television program since you've been retained in the Simpson defense to discuss this case?
As I recall, I came to Los Angeles on the June 16th, and I did appear on a number of television programs immediately thereafter, but on June 22nd, after going to the coroner's office and being finally allowed access to the various materials, I stopped having any contact with the press, as I recall.
Doctor,
There may have been one time after that I spoke to somebody.
did you appear, for example, on June 18th, 1994 on a CNN program, Newsmaker Saturday?
I appeared on programs, yes, until June 22nd, the idea being to try and get...
A move to strike is
Okay,
non-responsive.
yeah, I did. And I don't know about that, but I did appear in the press between the 17th and the 22nd.
And did you, as part of that interview, say that your job as part of the forensic team is to assist in identifying evidence, collect evidence, document it, and interpret it in the light of, to make a judgment as to whether or not he, meaning Mr. Simpson, is guilty or not of the crime, and whether there's mental reasons that comes long after the initial investigation as to whether he's being falsely accused? Did you say that, sir?
I don't recall that, but I don't recall that. So, I mean, I don't think so. I don't think so.
Would you like to see it?
No, I'm sure I said something like that. My role was to identify whatever...
I'll move to strike as
Okay.
non-responsive.
All right, we're gonna take our recess at this point. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're gonna take our mid-afternoon recess. Please remember all my amendment issues to you, and we'll be in recess for 15 minutes. Dr. Uncut.
Thank you.
All parties are again present. Deputy McNair, let's have the jurors, please. Please be seated. Record should reflect we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel, that Dr. Michael Baden is on the witness stand undergoing cross-examination by Mr. Kelberg. Mr. Kelberg, you may continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen, and to you, Doctor. Doctor, I don't believe you gave on direct examination whether or not you are presently employed full or part-time with any New York State Police agency. You did not make any mention of that, did you, sir?
I don't think I was asked that.
Okay. Are you, in fact, a part-time employee of the New York State Police?
Yes.
And, in fact, what is that part-time employment, sir?
I'm co-director of the Forensic Sciences Unit of the New York State Police. That's a half-time position.
In fact, that obligates you to give them a minimum of 20 hours a week, correct?
A minimum of 20 hours, but I'm on call 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, or have to provide coverage.
How many forensic pathologists are associated with that New York State Police unit of which you say you are the director?
I'm the co-director. Dr. Lowell Levine, a forensic dentist, is the other co-director. And we split one position. There are about 8 forensic pathologists who are associated with our unit.
Are there any who are full-time employees?
No, no,
Is one of the people associated with that Dr. Wolf?
no.
Is Dr. Wolf is not associated with the unit of which you are a co-director?
That's correct.
Is Dr. Wolf employed at all by the Albany State Police?
Dr. Wolf has been director of anatomic pathology at Albany Medical Center and is a forensic pathologist to Albany County and to about 20 other counties in upstate New York, about 63 counties in New York State, and she covers a great number of them.
How long has Dr. Wolf been a board-certified forensic pathologist?
Sustained.
Your Honor, maybe you heard on this?
Sustained.
Dr. Baden, did you bring Dr. Wolf into this case?
Sustained.
Dr. Baden, did you bring Dr. Wolf into the Boggs, Hanson, Hawkins case for the trials of the last 2 defendants?
Sustained.
Dr. Baden, is Dr. Wolf going to be the co-editor of this book that you say you're in the process of preparing?
She and I are working on a textbook of forensic medicine, yes.
And in fact, who, if anyone, is writing the chapter on sharp force injuries?
I will.
And has that been done yet, sir?
No,
Are
not
you gonna-
completed.
Are you going to use this case as an example for that chapter?
I don't know, Mr. Kelberg. I doubt it. Wouldn't use any case that can be identified.
Doctor, is it usually the case that with recognized forensic pathology texts or any other field of medical text, that the editors are usually physicians who have vast experience in the area the textbook is covering?
Not necessarily. There's many texts that are written by people who have little experience. That's why we don't have too many good texts about.
And therefore, let me ask you again, how long has Dr. Wolf been board certified in forensic pathology?
Sustained.
Doctor, you said you've done personally over 20,000 autopsies, is that correct?
Yes,
And in fact, the overwhelming bulk of those autopsies were done when you were still with the New York Medical Examiner's office, isn't that correct?
that's correct. Yes.
And that was a situation that you terminated 10 years ago, isn't that correct?
I left the New York City Medical Examiner's office in 1985, yes.
And sir, of those 20,000 autopsies that you, or over 20,000 that you personally performed, how many of them were multiple murder cases arising out of a single incident?
Overruled.
I'd say a few hundred. I mean, we've had single incidents with 15 persons killed and down to 2. But a few hundred, I would imagine.
How many of those involved sharp force injuries as the cause of death?
I don't know. I would imagine a good percentage of them, half maybe.
Doctor, isn't it?
Or probably gunshot wounds would be a little more than half.
Gunshot wounds would be
Probably
more than,
more than half.
Gentlemen.
gunshot wounds would be more than half of those multiple murder cases arising out of a single incident.
I would guess, yes. That would be my opinion as I sit here. I have never accumulated the cases in that manner.
Now, doctor, if you do roughly 1,000 autopsies a year, and that would be what would be required from 1965 to 1985 to get 20,000, right?
It would be starting in 1960, 1955, actually, but most of them would have been done between 65, from about 63.
Starting in 1955, doctor?
Yes, as a medical student, I started as a medical student to do autopsies as a volunteer, However, I didn't do that many until 62, 63, when I worked. I had an official job on weekends and holidays and vacation time.
You wouldn't be allowed to do criminal homicide autopsies when you were starting medical school, would you?
Not in medical school, no. Oh, most of these autopsies would be in non-criminal cases.
Now, doctor, roughly doing 1,000 autopsies a year for 20 years would be accurate?
A little less than that, right. That is approximately.
And would it be accurate to say that you took perhaps usually 2 weeks of vacation a year?
In my early days, I rarely took vacation, but maybe 2 weeks, yeah.
So if you worked 50 weeks a year, doing roughly 1,000 autopsies a year, you are doing roughly 20 autopsies a week,
That's correct.
personally doing.
That's correct.
And you said you supervised over 50,000 autopsies during the same period, isn't that correct?
I got to supervise more as I rose up and became deputy chief, but the supervision came a little later.
All right, if we just took for average purposes, that 50,000 over 20 years would be roughly supervising 2,500 autopsies a year?
Well, that easily, yes.
And again, 50 weeks, so you're looking at another 50 autopsies that you're supervising, correct?
That's correct. Not that I'm doing, that I'm supervising.
You're doing 20 and supervising 50?
Yeah.
And that means you're doing 4 autopsies a day roughly, working a 5-day week?
It worked out about 2 or 3 during the week and about 5 or 10 on weekend days. It varied.
And doctor, you have to prepare reports for each autopsy you do?
Yes.
And you have to testify in court sometimes?
Yes.
And sometimes you have to have your deposition taken if it's a civil case?
Rarely were there depositions. In New York State, it wasn't at that time a deposition type case, and there weren't too many civil litigations that we were involved in.
Doctor, of those 20 a week, how many of them were criminal homicide autopsies?
Of 8,000 cases, about 1,800 autopsies, something like 20%, 15%.
And how long would a criminal homicide autopsy take vis-a-vis the kinds that were not arising out of criminal homicide situations?
It varies. It varied.
Some of them take less than a half an hour?
Not too many. Not the homicide cases.
No, other than the criminal homicide. I'm talking about the non-criminal homicide.
An hour, 2 hours maybe.
And some of these, did they not even involve dissection of the body at all?
The autopsies involved dissection of the bodies. There were many other cases that I would issue death certificates without doing an autopsy. Those are what would call sign-out cases where an autopsy wasn't needed. So we might have in the city of New York at that time something like 30,000 deaths reported to the medical examiner's office each year out of 60, 70,000 deaths. And of those, about 8,000 would be autopsied. The rest would not be autopsied.
Doctor, is there an organization of forensic pathologists nationwide that issues recommended guidelines as to the number of autopsies which should be done by a particular doctor on a particular day?
There are guidelines that are set by a national organization, yes.
And isn't the guideline for the number of autopsies to be done no more than 2 a day?
I believe now the guidelines might be 2 a day and more than 250 a year per doctor, but that's of recent vintage. That's in the past 10 or 15 years. In the 1960s and especially, we just worked morning to night to get the work done, and there were very few doctors in the medical examiner's office at that time.
Doctor, your work with the New York State Police pays you approximately $39,000 to $40,000 a year?
You're very good, yes.
Well, you've testified about this in the past, haven't you, sir?
If I've been asked that question, I've given that answer.
And that's the accurate answer,
Yes.
isn't it?
Yes.
And, sir, your private practice, let's set aside the Simpson case. Are you still taking on other cases besides the Simpson case since you became involved in the Simpson case?
Not very much since my involvement with the Simpson this matter, But in general, I do other cases, and I will once this is finished.
And in fact, is it true, sir, that 3 to 4 times of your annual income is made from privately retained cases rather than the $39,000 or $40,000 you make from New York?
That's correct.
And in fact, you spend more than half of your time working on private retained cases rather than for the New York State Police cases. Isn't that correct?
I would think that's fair. That is counting the hours per week.
Now, Doctor, how many cases have you done where you've been privately retained? And by the way, privately retained, insurance companies have retained your services?
Yes.
And has that ever involved situations where the insurance company believes the decedent committed suicide and doesn't want to pay on the life insurance policy because there's a suicide exclusion?
It's not quite put that way. If the initial review by the insurance policy by the doctor on staff is that the cause of death is at issue or a question of suicide, which might exclude payment, then they would call myself or another forensic pathologist and ask us to review the case and ask us our opinion. If my opinion was that the person committed suicide, they'd act in one way. If my opinion was that the person didn't commit suicide, they might act in another way.
Now, you've also been retained by attorneys representing plaintiffs in civil actions,
Yes, sir.
and as you've said, by defense attorneys in criminal matters,
Yes, sir.
and by some prosecutors as well.
Yes.
And on these privately retained cases, you are paid, is that correct?
That's the intent. It doesn't always work that way, but I submit a bill, yes.
Now, Doctor, of those times that you've been retained privately, how many involve cases where you did not personally perform the autopsy?
Oh, in criminal or civil matters?
Altogether.
Well, commonly in insurance matters, I'm asked to review other people's work and the results, and in, I would say, a majority of my private practice, I review cases that other people have done, and I don't do an autopsy.
My question, though, sir, is approximately how many cases have you been retained on in your career for which you're paid, for which you did not personally do the autopsy?
Lots. I mean, we're going 30 years, back 30, 35 years. Many, many cases. Probably the majority. I'm just saying the majority of cases I'm retained on, I don't do the autopsy.
And in those situations, do you review any autopsy report that's been issued by the pathologist who performed the autopsy?
Yes.
Do you review photographs that may be in existence, whether police photographs or coroner office photographs?
Yes.
Do you review tissue samples if they are available?
Yes.
And doctor, when you do this, do you ever tell the party retaining you that you can't accept this work because since you didn't do the autopsy, it would be pure speculation for you to review these materials and render opinions?
No.
And in fact, have you ever turned money back after you've done a review to tell the party that retains you, I didn't do the autopsy, whatever I have in the way of an opinion from these materials would be pure speculation, here's your money back? Have you ever done anything like that?
That's not my opinion. No. If I agree to review a case, I'll review the case, and I'll do the best I can with the information available.
And in fact, you do render opinions in these retained cases based upon review of whatever was available, even though you did not do the autopsy.
Certainly.
Isn't that correct?
Absolutely.
And in fact, in the Boggs case that Mr. McKenzie retained you on, you didn't do the autopsy, did you?
No, I did not.
And in fact, you did review photographs, right?
That's true, yes.
And you did review an autopsy report by Dr. Sy, S.Y., Evancia Sy.
Yes.
And some of the photographs were taken of the body at the office of Dr. Boggs, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, doctor, you said this morning that you are critical of any forensic pathologist who would get on the witness stand and testify to possibilities. Isn't that what you said this morning?
I think what I said this morning was in the context of Mr. Shapiro's question, where all the opinions, or much of the opinions of, on the direct, your witness, Ms. Dr. Lakshmanan, were couched in possibilities.
Sir, in fact, the questions were couched as follows. Doctor, is a set of circumstances consistent with certain findings? Isn't that how the questions were couched, Doctor?
Many of them were, but that's possible. Is it consistent with, is difficult to interpret, because it could be consistent with 1% or it could be consistent with 95%. And that's a delicate area to explain to the trier of the facts as to what my opinion is. If my opinion is it's consistent with 1% that so-and-so happened, the jury should not give it as much weight as if it were consistent with 95%.
So, Doctor, is it your use of the term possibility to relate to doctors who talk in terms of consistent with or inconsistent with when questions are posed?
Look, what I said is that the witness, me in the blue chair, Dr. Lakshmanan in the blue chair here, can only answer the questions that the lawyers put to us. And I think we try to answer the questions the best we can. But if all we say is it's possible that it happened by a bushy-haired stranger who was right-handed from behind, yes, but it's also equally consistent with a bald-headed midget from the front who was left-handed. It's all, it depends on what kind of information I want to give across as an expert, but I don't have control over your questions or Mr. Shapiro's questions.
Well, Doctor, if you feel incapable of rendering an opinion because you do not hold an opinion to a reasonable medical certainty, then you can say that as a response to any hypothetical that's posed to you by any lawyer. Can you not?
Overruled.
In most states, I
I'll move
could
to
do
strike
that,
as
but
not-
not here.
The answer stands.
Yeah.
You cannot do that
No,
here?
no, I think my impression is from the testimony that questions are permissible here that wouldn't be permissible in other states.
Well, Doctor, my question, though, to you is, do you feel that you, as the witness, as the expert, in response to a hypothetical question, can say, I can't answer that. I don't have enough information. It would be speculation. I don't talk in terms of possibilities. I talk only in terms of reasonable medical certainty. Can you do that, sir?
Surely I can, but that's a compound question. Certainly, if I don't have enough information, I can't answer it. I'll say I don't have enough information. That's beyond my expertise. But I think that I'm at the, I have to answer the questions that are put to me, and as best I can.
Well, and as best you can could involve answering, I can't answer that question because I can't answer to a reasonable medical certainty. That is an answer you could give, isn't it,
I could
sir?
give that, yes.
Now, sir, didn't you, in the course of your direct examination, at least 10 or 12 times, offer answers that included the word possibility when
don't-
asked hypothetical questions?
I don't think so. It's possible. That's possible, but I don't think so. If I did, I'd try to couch it in the sense that I'm giving it with a different degree of certainty than if I answered to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, so that the jury can distinguish what I'm trying to say.
Well, for example, the shoe. Remember the shoe photo that was shown?
Yes?
You said that cut in the front of the shoe? You said it was not proof of it that Mr. Goldman had kicked
That's
the
right.
knife, right? Not proof of it.
But
Ju-
it's my opinion.
Excuse me, you said cut on the top was indicative of kicking.
Yeah.
Isn't that correct, sir?
Wait. He didn't finish asking the question. Let him finish.
Yes.
Let him finish answering the question as well.
Thank you, Your Honor, I will.
We will be here through tomorrow if we keep up like this. Let's move along, all right?
I'm trying to, Your Honor.
Let's get past the semantics.
By indicative, I meant more likely than not, more than 50%,
What's your definition of to a reasonable medical certainty, sir?
more than 95%.
So according to your criticism that you gave this morning, you should not be offering an opinion that you cannot say to 95% certainty. Isn't that your view?
Depends on the question. It depends what the question is and what the information that's being elicited.
Well, sir, did you ever qualify any of the answers you gave by saying, this is not to a reasonable medical certainty, this is only something I feel 50% plus one, a sense of confidence in.
I don't think I used those words.
Well, did you qualify any of them?
At times, I said it got monotonous to a reasonable degree of medical certainty when I gave answers.
Sir, have you ever heard the term beyond a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes,
That's a term you've used, isn't it?
certainly. Yes.
Can you tell me the source for your knowledge of that term?
It's a term that's used in New York State courts. It's
Does
one of the, I'd have to defer to Mr. Scheck on that. It's a lawyer term that we're asked not uncommonly in New York.
Well, as a forensic pathologist, doctor, aren't you trained in the relationships between the law and pathology?
Oh, yes, but we're not trained in the law as such. I'm not a lawyer. I don't deem to answer legal questions. I don't even know the difference between a hearing and a trial, as you pointed out. But what I'd say is we know knowledge that's applicable to the law.
Doctor, did you write in your report to Mr. McKenzie on the death of Ellis Green, among other things, it is further my opinion beyond a reasonable degree of medical certainty that the medical autopsy and toxicological findings presently available are entirely consistent with the cause of death being asphyxia by suffocation, and that Mr. Green's alcohol-impaired condition at the time of death made him vulnerable and susceptible to die from such a cause. Did you write that in your report?
I will take you at your word. Yes, it sounds right.
Sir, what does beyond a reasonable degree of medical certainty mean to you?
beyond 95% certainty, the same as to a reasonable degree of medical certainty. I'm not in a syntax mode there.
In your mind, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty and beyond a reasonable degree of medical certainty are synonymous terms?
They're used synonymously in New York courts.
Doctor, did you prepare a report for this case?
No.
In the cases where you were retained by our office, the Belushi case and the Boggs case, you either prepared a report or signed an affidavit spelling out your findings. Isn't that correct?
I did prepare a report, as you indicate, in the Boggs case, and I would be guided by whatever you said about Mr. Belushi.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Thank you.
Have you shown that to Mr. Shapiro?
Doctor, were you asked to sign an affidavit in order to extradite Kathy Evelyn Smith from Canada?
Yes, I remember that now.
And you read it thoroughly, in fact, made some notations on it, didn't you? Before signing it?
Around 12 years ago, I assume so.
Now, doctor, why haven't you prepared a report in this case of your findings?
Well, I wasn't asked to prepare a report. I was in constant conversations with Mr. Shapiro, but I was not asked to prepare a report. It's not usually my custom to prepare a report without being asked.
And doctor, is that because you don't want to give the opponent any advance notice of what your views may be to prepare for cross-examination?
No, that's not so.
But
In
in-
fact, if you called me, Mr. Kelberg, I would have been glad to talk to you,
Doctor,
as we once did before.
We did, doctor, and that was arranged by the defense attorney, wasn't it?
I believe so, yes.
And then you had to cut short that conversation, didn't you? Because you were tied up at a convention.
I don't remember.
Well, in fact, I was not permitted to finish questioning you, that we had to put it off for another time, and I was not permitted to follow up any questioning beyond the 20 minutes that I talked with you. Isn't that what happened in that case,
I don't
sir?
recall that at all, but I'm sure if you say so, I would think it's correct.
Now, doctor, you examined Mr. Simpson's hands on June 17th. Is that correct?
Yes, I did.
And, sir, did you document carefully each and every finding that you made in that examination?
I made notes, yes. I made notes.
And you've told us, I think on direct, how important it is for a medical examiner to document carefully all the findings,
Oh,
correct?
yes, with notes and photographs, and we took photographs too, yes.
And doctor, it doesn't matter whether you're the medical examiner performing the autopsy or you're a privately retained expert, such as you are in this case, the need to carefully document exists in either situation, right?
That's fair, yes.
Now, doctor, do you have your notes with you?
I think I have a copy of notes. Yes, sir.
You do. Do you have your note or notes of the examination of Mr. Simpson's hand or hands on June 17th, 1994?
Yes,
Could you produce that for me, please?
I have, this is a copy I think that you have. But also, it was documented with multiple photographs.
Your Honor, may this document be marked as people's next in order? One page?
Why don't you show it to Mr.
Be glad to.
I'm sorry, Mrs. Robertson? 580, 580? I'm gonna have to get a clerk who talks louder.
Exhibit 580, Your Honor?
580.
Then may I approach?
You may.
Now, doctor, this exhibit is the only documentation in a written form of your observations of both the left and right hands of Mr. Simpson on June 17th. Is that correct?
The only written material, yes.
Mr. Fairtlow? May I ask you please to put this on the Almo? Now, doctor, we're looking at the upper portion, and in fact, what we're looking at now is your written notation concerning the left hand examination. Is that correct?
Yes, I can't see it very clearly, and
Let me give you, I think I might have another clean copy of that.
thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure that I can find it that
All right,
quickly.
why don't you give the copy?
To Mrs. Robertson, I'll have one of the law clerks make a quick photocopy.
I'll tell you what, let me give the doctor my, it's marked up a little bit, but he'll be easily able to tell.
Who's this who's?
Thank you.
Who's this who's? Now, doctor, you only reflect in this notation the left hand, is that correct? You make no reference with respect to the condition of the right hand.
That's correct.
And doctor, did you follow the testimony of Dr. Robert Huizinga when he was called by the defense as a witness earlier in this trial?
Some of it, not all of it.
Have you read his testimony?
No.
Have you heard his,
He was present at the time.
have you heard his testimony regarding his examination of Mr. Simpson's left and right hands on June 15th, and then his presence when you were examining the hands on June 17th? Did you hear his testimony?
I recall testimony that he gave relative to what he saw in his office on June 15th.
Now, doctor, do you recall hearing him say, in response to a question I asked, that he found on the left hand 3 or 4 cuts, depending on how you want to define the cuts, because there's one that had an interruption, which if it was all part of one process would be 1 cut rather than 2. Do you recall that?
I believe so, yes.
Do you recall him also saying that he observed 7 abrasions to the left hand?
I recall some of that type of testimony. I'm not specific, that there were additional injuries that he saw that I had not seen.
Doctor, let me just briefly refer you to some testimony that was given by Dr. Huizinga referring to page 37-267 of the transcript, line 18 through 20. How many separate abrasions did you identify?
Just a second. Mr. Blazer, do you have that available? All right. Mr. Blazer has it available.
Question, how many separate abrasions did...
Hold on.
Starting on line 18.
Over.
Doctor, did you hear this testimony from Dr. Huizinga? Question, how many separate abrasions did you identify? Answer, 7. Question, and did you also count the number of cuts to his left hand? Answer, yes, I did. Question, how many did you identify? Answer, 3 cuts, one of which on the 4th finger had both an A and B portion. Question, that's the ring finger, correct? Answer, correct. Did you hear that testimony before, Doctor?
I think so.
Doctor, how many abrasions did you identify in this note that you made of your examination of Mr. Simpson's left hand on June 17th?
I did not see those abrasions on the 17th, which was 2 days later, and I did photograph Mrs. Simpson's hands with Dr. Lee, and to document the injuries, and I don't recall there being abrasions at that time,
May I approach
which
you?
is 2 days later, so they could have healed.
These are the exhibits that previously been marked.
These matters have already been marked. Do you need to see these? Let's bring them over.
I would like to see what he's referring to as a
All right.
courtesy.
That is a common courtesy. You're right. Mr. Kelberg?
We'll show the doctor in the 518 series.
All right, Mr. Shapiro, do you want to approach and take a look at these as well, the ones that Dr. Baden has in his possession at this moment? Take your pick. Right, proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, let me show you, if I could please, first Exhibit 518E. Have you seen that photograph before?
And Doctor, you can take it out of the holder if you like.
Thank you, sir. I believe I have, but I'm not sure what day it was taken.
Let me show you 518C. Have you seen that photograph before?
Yes, but again, this wasn't taken by me.
Doctor, do you see in the 518C that there is a blue ruler?
Yes, it's, I believe it's supposed to be a gray ruler. It turns out blue in this.
Doctor, did Dr. Lee or you, in the course of having photographs taken, have a ruler placed in the photographs?
In some of the photographs, we had rulers, yes.
And if Dr. Huizinga did not use a ruler when he was having photographs taken at his office on the 15th, would that indicate to you that if the photo has a ruler in it, that it is a photo taken on the 17th?
I'm not sure. We only have 17% gray rulers, so that doesn't look, it has the form of a ruler that Dr. Lee or I would have used, but not necessarily, but not the right color.
I'm going to ask Mr. Fairlow to put 518C on the Elmo.
He said he's seen the photo, Counsel.
Doctor, I want to invite your attention if Mr. Fairlow can zoom in on the left thumb area, please. Doctor, do you see the area that is highlighted now by the close-up of this photograph?
Yes.
Do you document that, what appears to be an injury below the thumbnail?
I don't recall seeing that. And I do not believe this was a photograph taken on the 17th.
Doctor, then if it was taken on the 15th, your testimony is that that injury, you do believe that that's an injury, do you not?
Yes,
Would you call it an abrasion?
that's fair, yes.
Is it your testimony that it healed between its state as seen in this photo, if the photo was taken on June 15th, and when you saw Mr. Simpson's hand on the 17th?
Yes. Oh, sorry.
Now, doctor, is it your testimony then that you saw none of the 7 abrasions that Dr. Huizinga said were present on the left hand along with the cuts?
I did not, I do not recall seeing any of those abrasions.
And you don't document any of them on your note,
No,
do you?
I don't have it in my notes, and I would have to check the photographs taken on the 17th that were further documentation.
And now let me ask 518E could be placed on the Elmo, and ask Mr. Fairlow, looking now more below the fingers, back of the hand. Doctor, there was a stipulation that these photos were taken on the 15th and the 17th. Defense counsel offered it and I accepted it.
Correct.
Yes, but that's not a foundation that this doctor has seen these on the 17th, nor taken on
Has-
the 17th.
Doctor, what we are looking at on this photograph, did you see this area that's highlighted now when you examined Mr. Simpson on the 17th?
No.
And do those appear to be abrasions?
You're right, there's no foundation, he's never
Overruled.
answered the question.
Overruled.
May I see the photograph? It's a little blurry here.
Sure. May I take it, Mr. Fairwell?
Yeah, there appears to be a healing, some kind of healing mark that you were referring to
And
on
if
the back
Doc,
of the hand.
and if
It's a
Dr.
sort of a- yeah, I'm sorry.
and if Dr. Huizinga referred to it as an abrasion, would you trust his judgment on that?
Yeah, yes.
Now, did you see abrasions along the left wrist of Mr. Simpson when you examined him on the 17th?
I would have to look at the photographs taken on the 17th because I have a notation in the sheet that you gave me and that you've retrieved of something on the wrist, in the area of the wrist, and I just don't recall.
First of all, let me just show you one of the defense photographs, which is 1249, and ask you if that appears to be a photograph taken on the 17th when you were present or at some other time and location.
It appears that this photograph at the top that you're showing to me 1249 was taken at the time that I was examining Mr. Simpson on the 17th.